For the last 100 years or so, there have been these two absolute giants in the world of economics, and their ideas have shaped everything, from the taxes you pay to the interest rate on your car loan. This is the story of that epic battle of ideas, Keynes versus Friedman.
And really, it all boils down to one single massive question. When the economy hits the skids, when millions of people are out of work and businesses are shutting down, what's the right thing for the government to do? This question kicked off an economic revolution, and then a counter-revolution that we're still living with today. And the answers you get, well, they couldn't be more polar opposite. On one side, you've got the argument that the government has to step in, and step in decisively to save the economy. But on the other side, there's this Dean just makes things worse. What's wild is that for a huge chunk of time, this wasn't even really a debate. Coming out of the Great Depression and World War II, pretty much the whole world agreed on one of those answers. It became the new rulebook, a promise of a better, more stable future.
Yeah, that idea came from the mind of British economist John Maynard Keynes. His book from 1936, The General Theory, wasn't just a book. It became the literal blueprint for the entire post-war global economy.
Okay, so the core idea of Keynesianism is pretty straightforward when you think about it. It's all about spending, or what economists call aggregate demand. Think of the economy like a car. It doesn't matter how great the engine is if nobody's actually pressing the gas pedal. If people and businesses stop spending, that's the demand part. The whole system just grinds to a halt. So how does a government get that engine revving again? Keynes's big idea was something called the multiplier effect. Let's break it down. Imagine the government spends $1 million to build a new bridge. That money doesn't just stop. It goes into the pocket of a construction worker. What does she do? She goes out and spends it at the grocery store. Now the grocery store owner has more money, and he uses it to pay his suppliers. That single chunk of government spending creates a ripple effect, getting spent over and over and over again, multiplying its original power across the whole economy. So this way of thinking basically handed governments this powerful new toolkit. They could use fiscal policy, big spending projects and tax cuts, or they could use monetary policy, like fiddling with interest rates to make it cheaper to borrow money. For Keynes, the number one goal was always full employment. He was convinced that people being out of work wasn't some personal failing. It was a sign of a sick economy that just wasn't producing enough demand. And you know what? For about 30 years, this whole model seemed to be working like a dream. Western economies were booming, unemployment was low, things were good. But then the 1970s happened, and a brand new economic sickness started to spread, one that nobody had a cure for. This nightmare had a name: stagflation. For the very first time, we saw unemployment going up and inflation going up at the exact same time. The price of everything was skyrocketing, but so were the unemployment lines. This was a monster that just wasn't supposed to exist. Now, according to all the Keynesian textbooks, this was just impossible. The going wisdom for decades was this idea called the Phillips curve. It basically said there's a simple trade-off, like a seesaw. If inflation goes up, unemployment goes down. And if unemployment goes up, inflation goes down. But now, the seesaw was broken. Both ends were flying up at the same time. The worst of both worlds. And just like that, the whole Keynesian toolkit felt completely useless. If you tried to fix unemployment by spending more money, you'd just make inflation even worse. But if you tried to fight inflation, you'd throw millions more people out of a job. The dominant economic theory was officially broken, leaving this huge intellectual void. But into that vacuum stepped a new challenger, Milton Friedman and his crew of fiercely free market economists from the University of Chicago. They'd been making their case against Keynes for years, but nobody was really listening. Now, all of a sudden, the world was desperate for a new answer. Friedman's big counterargument was a theory called monetarism, and he basically said, hey, you guys are all looking in the wrong place. He argued the problem isn't a lack of spending. The real control lever for the entire economy, he said, is the total amount of money floating around in the system, the money supply.
And this leads to probably his most famous line ever. For Friedman, the reason for inflation was dead simple. The government was printing too much money. Period. It wasn't complicated. It wasn't about oil shocks or powerful unions. It was just too many dollars chasing too few goods. And let me tell you, Friedman's ideas didn't stay locked up in an ivory tower. They moved fast, from the classroom right into the halls of power.
He was an advisor to President Nixon, his theories were put into practice in Chile, he won the Nobel Prize, and he became the intellectual godfather for the economic policies of leaders like Ronald Reagan in the US and Margaret Thatcher in the UK. And when it came to unemployment, their ideas were in a head-on collision. For Keynes, it was involuntary, a failure of the market that the government absolutely had to fix. Friedman, on the other hand, argued there's a natural rate of unemployment, and any attempt by the government to force unemployment below that natural rate was, in his view, doomed to fail and would just create a ton of inflation.
And, of course, on the big question of government's role in all this, the divide was just as massive. Keynes saw government spending as the key to calming down a naturally volatile economy. Friedman saw it the other way around. He believed the market was naturally stable, and it was usually clumsy government intervention that was causing all the problems in the first place.
So Friedman and his crew, they built this really powerful case. First up, they said short-term stimulus, like a one-off government check, doesn't really work. Why? Because you don't base your spending on a temporary windfall, you base it on what you expect to earn over the long haul. Second, they introduced this killer idea of rational expectations. The theory is that people aren't dumb, they learn, they adapt, and they anticipate what the government's going to do. So if everyone knows a stimulus is coming that's going to cause inflation, they just demand higher wages ahead of time, and boom, the policy is useless before it even gets off the ground.
So, by the time we hit the 1980s, it was pretty clear the counter-revolution had won. Friedman's ideas were the new consensus. But a new generation of economists was about to grab the baton and run even further with it.
The torch was passed to Friedman's intellectual heirs, a group called the New Classicals. And they didn't just follow in his footsteps, they took his ideas and cranked them up to 11. Led by an economist named Robert Lucas, they took Friedman's skepticism about government and turned it into an outright declaration that it was totally futile. Thanks to those rational expectations, they argued stimulus wasn't just a bad idea in the long run, it was completely useless even in the short term. And to back this all up, they started building these incredibly complex mathematical models of the economy. But a lot of these models were built around this, well, kind of strange idea, the representative agent. It basically assumes you can understand the entire messy, complicated global economy by modeling the behavior of one single, perfectly rational, average person. Now, this became a standard tool in economics, but critics will quickly point out that these were the very models that completely failed to see the 2008 financial crisis coming. And that, of course, brings us right up to today, because the debate is far from over. After the 2008 crisis, we saw a huge comeback of Keynesian ideas, with government stepping in on a massive scale. And then, the enormous stimulus spending during the pandemic was just the next chapter in this ongoing saga. The fundamental fight between intervention and free markets is as fierce and as relevant as it's ever been. So, here we are, left with the ultimate question, as we stare down the barrel of huge new challenges: climate change, inequality, artificial intelligence. Which playbook are we going to reach for? The one written by John Maynard Keynes or the one by Milton Friedman? The answer to that question is going to define the world for all of us.